What has been the most incredible coincidence in history? What about the twin brothers back in the 70s? One was hit and killed on a moped by a taxi driver. Almost a year to the day later, the other brother was hit and killed on the same moped by the same driver carrying the same passenger. That's some coincidental shit. A mate's dad, a lawyer, once dialed the number of a client, a doctor. A woman answered, sounded a little confused, but said that yes, doctor / name was there. When the doctor came on the line he sounded a little confused too, but they discussed the case. At the end of the call, the doctor said, by the way, how did you get this number? You gave it to me, said my mate's dad. No I didn't. I'm on a house call. The lawyer reads back the number. They realize he had misdialed. After his sister's suicide, a man vowed revenge on Harry Ziegland, the sweeter who had broken his sister's heart, prompting her to take her life. The brother shot at Ziegland, who fell to the ground. Believing his task done, the brother shot and killed himself with the same gun. However, the bullet meant for Ziegland did not strike him. Instead, it lodged itself into a nearby tree. / 3 years later, Ziegland was working to clear that same location and used dynamite to remove the tree. The explosion sent the bullet flying, striking, and killing Ziegland. There's a whole thing with the King of Italy meeting his doppelganger. They had a ton of life experiences that were identical. Family names, birthday, home locations. They got murdered the same day. Victor Emmanuel II, for anyone that wants to look it up. Edit, Umberto I, not Vic II. West End Baptist Church incident between 1920 and 1950. Martha Poole was the stern choir director at West End Baptist Church in Beatrice, Nebraska. She demanded punctuality in her choir members. They all had to be at church at 7:25 p.m. for practice. In the past, they had arrived on time with very few exceptions. However, on the night of March 1st, 1950, they all were delayed for various reasons as they readied to leave for practice. Marilyn Ruth Klemple, the pastor's daughter, spilled food on her dress and her mother needed to iron a new one. Herbert Kipf was trying to get a letter in the mail on time. He planned to be a few minutes late, deciding that he could drop it off on the way to practice. Lucille Jones was too busy listening to a radio program and was late along with Dorothy Wood, whom she was supposed to pick up. Royina Rests and her sister, Sadie, were late because their car wouldn't start. Joyce Black, who lived across the street from the church, was ready but too tired to get up. La Donna Vandergrift was having trouble with a geometry problem. Mrs. Leonard Schuster Wold-Vorden really arrived at 7:20 with her daughter, Susan. But on this particular evening, she had to go to her mother's house to help her get ready for a missionary meeting. Because his wife was away, Harvey AHL was taking care of his two sons. He was going to take them to practice with him, but somehow he got wound up talking. When he looked at his watch, he saw that he was already late. Marilyn Poole, the pianist, had planned to arrive half an hour early. However, she fell asleep after dinner, and when her mother awakened her at 7:15, she only had time to tidy up and start out. Martha Poole, the choir director and Marilyn's mother, was simply late because Marilyn was. She had tried unsuccessfully to awaken her earlier. At 4:30 p.m., Walter Klemple, the pastor, turned on the heat to warm the church and departed. Instead, it filled with gas and exploded at 7:27 p.m., 2 minutes after practice was supposed to begin. However, since none of the members had arrived, not a single one was harmed in the explosion in what was deemed an incredible coincidence or an extreme miracle. From this source, http Unsolved Mysteries. Wikia.com Wiki West End Baptist Church. In 1898, Morgan Robertson wrote a fiction novel called Futility. It features a large luxurious ocean liner named Titan which strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks, claiming a large majority of her passengers. 14 years later, the Titanic strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks. After hitting an iceberg, a large majority of her passengers dying in the frigid waters. The similarities are uncanny. Both ships were 800 feet long. Both ships displaced roughly 45,000 tons. Both ships had 3 screws I. Imga. Como Q5RQMX. JPG. Both ships did not have enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew. Both ships struck an iceberg and sank in the month of April. Both ships struck an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. Both were 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland. Both ships struck the iceberg on their starboard side. It's incredible. Tsutomu Yamaguchi. It was August 6, 1945. Another successful day of a 3-month-long business trip in Hiroshima when bam, the city gets nuked. He's burned and has ruptured eardrums, but thankfully still alive. But of course he has to tell everyone about this blinding light and this inexplicable destruction of the city. Time to go home and heal up, right? Nope. August 9th, 1945. Just as he is telling a friend about his incredible experience, Boxcar drops a nuclear turd and destroys his hometown of Nagasaki. Edit. Yes, by divine intervention, he survived the second bombing and passed away just a few years ago. Hitler and Stalin both lived in Vienna at the same time and frequented the same park. Trotsky also lived there, along with a few other future WWII leaders. Hitler had a bunch of coincidental run-ins throughout his life. It wasn't just Stalin in that neighborhood. Trotsky, Tito, and Freud lived in the same neighborhood of Vienna at the same time, 1913. Earlier in his life, Hitler attended the same primary school as analytic philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. They were even in the same class together. Wittgenstein skipped ahead a year, and Hitler was held back one. There's even an unfounded conspiracy theory that Wittgenstein was the reason Hitler became anti-Semitic. Wittgenstein was rich, Jewish, and a total bully and asshole. Edit. 1913, not 2013. Stalin, Trotsky, and Tito weren't a bunch of time-traveling communists on an adventure with their psychologist friend to hunt down a time-leaping mustachioed fascist. During the Civil War, the life of President Lincoln's son, Robert, was saved by Edwin Booth, the brother of the man who would later assassinate Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth. Oh, also, Robert Todd Lincoln visited his father's death after Abe was shot. Then like 20 years later, was standing next to Garfield when he was shot. Then 20 years after that, was in Buffalo. As was McKinley. When McKinley was shot, poor guy got a complex too. Was invited to some fancy White House thing years later, and wrote a letter literally saying, if only they knew how bad he was for presidents, they wouldn't invite him. In 1835, Richard Lawrence Wikipedia, org wiki Richard Lawrence, failed assassin / attempted to assassinate President Andrew Jackson from very close range, but his gun misfired. Luckily for him, he had a backup, and before he was apprehended, he shot again at Jackson, and his gun misfired again. President Jackson proceeded to beat him to a pulp in public view with his cane until the police pulled Lawrence away, so he wouldn't die, and he spent the rest of his life in insane asylums. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe's only novel was published. One of the plot lines included a shipwrecked crew who drew straws to see who was to be eaten. Richard Parker was the character who drew the shortest straw and was eaten. 1884. A yacht sank in a storm, and the 4 men survived stranded on a lifeboat. One of the survivors, a 17-year-old boy, fell overboard and drank some seawater to quench his thirst. As he started to deteriorate quite quickly, the others chose to kill him and eat him before he became too sick. That boy's name was Richard Parker. Monty Python even wrote a sketch inspired by the shipwreck, and that's why the tiger is named Richard Parker in Life of Pi, because the author was fascinated by so many Richard Parkers being shipwrecked. There are apparently several other instances. Pretty much everything Rasputin did. Every time the Romanov's son, Alexei, got ill, he told them he would recover, and somehow it worked. They thought he was a man of God. He was basically a drunk homeless dude that saved their son every time Alexei was on the brink of death. Because of that they trusted him, and he basically called the shots, and had an incredible influence on Russia during WW1. My dad grew up in Hong Kong. He had a very close friend in high school. They drifted, but my dad did invite him to his and my mom's wedding. They hanged out a few times, but stopped all contact after that. A few years later my dad immigrated to Canada with my mom. They had me and my little sister, and we lived in the city of Vancouver. 2 years ago we moved to a new house in a city right beside Vancouver. The week after we officially moved in, my dad was taking out the trash. He heard someone yell out his Chinese name, which is odd, since not that many people called him by it. He turned around, only to see his old high school friend again. Turns out his friend also immigrated to Canada, and not only that, lived in the house directly beside ours. He also has a son and a daughter, both around the same ages as me and my sister. This was the first time my dad had seen his friend in over 25 years. Richard Nixon meeting Louis Armstrong at a New York airport in 1958, just before he was about to get caught in security with 3 pounds of marijuana. Nixon offered to carry the bags without knowing their contents, and Armstrong got his part through airport control. In the months leading up to D-Day in June 1944, 3 of the 5 code names for the beaches where the amphibious landing would take place, Gold, Sword, and Juno, showed up in the crossword puzzle of the Daily Telegraph, a British newspaper. MI5 got involved and arrested the editor on suspicion of espionage. Turns out the man was completely innocent and just happened to have those words in the same paper in those months. A personal, mildly interesting coincidence. My birthday is February 14th, 1990. My uncle's birthday is February 14th, 1960. His uncle's birthday was February 14th, 1930. Heard this on NPR a few weeks ago. A woman once wondered how a person knew who they should spend the rest of their lives with, so she wrote her name on a few dollar bills with a Sharpie. Years later, a guy she was dating gave her one of the bills framed and said, "Hey, look, I found a dollar bill with your name in it." She married him and didn't even tell him the story until after the wedding because she didn't want to freak him out. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died on the same day, which happened to be on the 4th of July 1826 of all days, 50 years to the day after they both signed the Declaration of Independence. When Mark Twain was born in 1835, it was on the day of the appearance of Halley's Comet. He died on the day it next appeared in 1910. /0 on top of that, he predicted his own death saying, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, 1910, and I expect to go out with it. It will be the greatest disappointment of my life if I don't go out with Halley's Comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt. Now here are these 2 unaccountable freaks. They came in together. They must go out together. Apostrophe. I'm late to the show, but my family's own story of coincidence. When I was only 2 my crazy parents bought a sailboat wrecked in a Florida hurricane. It was a beautiful 43 feet fiberglass antique vessel with massive holes in the hull. They spent 6 years fixing it up before taking the family on a sailing trip across the Pacific. We sailed from the western seaboard to Hawaii, through the islands, and then stopped in New Zealand for the storm season. We were going to be in New Zealand for 6 to 7 months, and decided to purchase a used car for our stay, so we had a way to get around. The used car salesman told us that he used to own a sailboat and asked us what type of boat we had, to which we replied that it was a Hans Christian's. He enthusiastically replied that he also had a Hans Christian sailboat, which we thought was just used car salesman bogus. He told us that his boat was in Florida when a hurricane came through and threw it on the shore, making it was an insurance write-off, but he couldn't remember the name. When he finally remembered, he called out to us while he was leaving that his boat's name was Free Alphin, the former name of our sailboat. We bought a shipwrecked sailboat from Florida, rebuilt it, sailed it to New Zealand, and 10 years later bought a car from the former owner of the sailboat without ever knowing who he was. Edit. Even with my atrocious grammar and punctuation, my first gold. Thank you, random stranger. A guy in Australia won $250,000 on a scratch to win, which enabled him to afford some life-saving surgeries. The news decided to do a story on him and filmed him buying the scratchy, just as he did on the day when he won. A reenactment of sorts. As they were filming him, he scratched and genuinely won another $250,000 right there on camera. Video here. Yao 2. B6R5MQXCKDV8. My grandfather on my father's side was a civil engineer in the military during WW2. He was sent to numerous fronts, From India to Baghdad to North Africa to Italy. He became a fairly high-ranking officer nearing the end of the war. My mother's parents met in North Africa at the same time. He was an accountant and logistics officer. She was a field nurse. They decided to get married, so they took furlough and went to Italy, post-Italian surrender. As I understand it, a high-ranking officer was required to sign your marriage certificate if you were getting married on base. Well, as the story is told, my grandfather, the engineer, was currently stationed in Italy at that base, having been transporting POWs from the Middle East. As a high-ranking officer, he wound up signing the marriage certificate of my mother's parents with little fanfare or consequence. Post WW2, both parties wound up moving to Vancouver, Canada by coincidence. Although my parents are 9 years apart in age, they wound up meeting and getting together. A few years later, they wound up getting married, having no knowledge of the previous connection that existed between their parents. Over the years, it was digging at my grandmother why she knew the last name of her daughter's husband. It's a very unique last name. So she does some digging. Eventually she digs out her marriage certificate, and there it is, my paternal grandfather's signature. Unbeknownst to everyone, my parents had a connection dating back years to a military base in Italy because of a massive series of coincidences and a signature on a marriage certificate. Now that's a small world story. There's a whole episode of Radiolab about crazy coincidences. My favorite is the Jewish boy who studied abroad in Paris and rented the same old maid's quarters that his father had hid from the Nazis in for several years during the war. There was a This American Life episode, or one of those shows in that neck of the entertainment woods, about crazy coincidences. I believe they researched and validated all the stories they told to the best of their ability. My favorite story was about a man and woman met in college, fell in love, dated for a few years, then got married. One day, they were going through their respective photo albums, and the girl got to some pictures from when she was really young. 5 or so I think, and on a family holiday to Disney. The guy was excited, saying that they went on a family trip to Disney when he was around that age too. So he finds his photos of the vacation, and in the background of one of them is his now wife being pushed in a stroller by her grandma. Sorry if I butchered the details. I heard this a long time ago, but even if some of the specifics are wrong, the broad strokes are still pretty amazing.